Welcome to Sharpe Insights, Conversations with Your Plan Giving Experts, a podcast for development professionals. Whether you're new to the field or looking to enhance your existing program, we will provide practical tips, expert advice, and real-world stories to deepen your understanding of plan giving. If you're committed to securing long-term support for your nonprofit, you've come to the right place.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Grant Miller. What happens when a good-hearted gift spirals into litigation, controversy, and a public relations nightmare? In this episode of Plan Giving Perspectives, we'll explore some good gifts gone bad. Today we're joined by 4 plan giving experts who will share stories of well-intentioned gifts with unanticipated consequences, and what your organization can do to ensure your gift agreements don't go sideways. Our special guest today is Chris Woehrle, an adjunct professor of taxation at Widger Law School at Villanova University. Chris brings the experience and perspective of a lawyer, development professional, and a generous donor to multiple institutions. Chris, thanks so much for being here today.
Wonderful to be here with everyone.
I'm also grateful to welcome back Sharpe consultants Kristin Croone, Joe Chickey, and Julie Schuldner. Hey guys, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Grant. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Thanks for being here. Yeah, Chris, we're really grateful that you're here. And of course, Joe, Kristin, and Julie, welcome back. I look forward to hearing y'all's stories about these gifts gone bad and the lessons that you've all learned to make sure our gifts go right in the future. Julie, how about we start with you? I understand you had an experience where you arranged a gift of property, and during the process, the donor expressed some confusion about having made the gift at all. Can you tell us about that?
I sure can. Thanks so much, Grant. And I really like this topic. And I think all of us sharing our personal experiences will be very helpful for all of our listeners, as I'm sure they'll deal with similar experiences. I was working at a continuing care retirement community. That was my previous role prior to being a Sharpe consultant. And this particular experience was very eye-opening and really provided a lesson in ethics for our whole team. We had a longtime resident at our community. She had been a consistent annual donor. She actively attended and supported our events. She even contributed to our theater through a small naming opportunity. And that contribution got her really excited for giving a much larger gift. She actually was interested in naming our ticket office. So she approached us with the intent to sell her vehicle in order to provide a gift for this naming opportunity within the theater. So she requested that we assist in facilitating the sale of the vehicle. And when we went to follow up to discuss next steps after the vehicle sold, she appeared confused about the sale. She started to express uncertainty as to why her car had been sold. So you can imagine how we felt at this point. This was a super unusual situation. She had previously demonstrated clarity in her decision-making. So we initially attributed the confusion just to a temporary lapse, and we moved forward with finalizing the naming opportunity. Over the subsequent months, though, we observed a much more noticeable and rapid decline in her cognitive abilities. And so in response to this, we made the decision to suspend all fundraising outreach to her out of respect for her well-being, and more importantly, to uphold our ethical standards as a development team. Unfortunately, some of these similar situations have been reported by our peers, and as a result, the Sharpe team has expanded our ethics training to specifically address how to navigate interactions with individuals who may be experiencing cognitive decline, and it really reinforces our ethical responsibilities as fundraisers to ensure that donor intent is clearly understood and, of course, respected. So overall, we were able to help her out, receive the gift, but it definitely provided us with a learning experience, and we changed our tactics. We started going in teams on these visits. We invited family to sit in, and we also began to note situations like this in our CRM, not the diagnosis, but just the particulars around the situation. So it was a good gift gone sort of bad, I would say.
The gift ended up being contributed anyway. And you said that you brought in family members and things like that. What are some of the other things you had to do to ensure that this gift was given to the organization?
So we received the gift, but moving forward with some of our other interactions, because the age of our donors was much more advanced as a whole, we began to make our visits in teams of two, either two staff members, a staff member and a board member, just to be able to have another person observing the interaction with that individual because of the demographic of our donors. It was actually interesting, though, because it was an independent living community, you really needed to get the buy-in of the donor in order to have them invite family to sit in. So that was also an option if we were unable to visit that person in teams.
Hi, Julie. This is Chris. I have a question for you.
Of course.
Do you have a protocol about, say, someone who is in assisted living? Does that status in and of itself mean there's not going to be development contact, or could there be contact, but you've got certain parameters to make sure the donor has capacity enough to make good decisions?
Of course. In our experience, we really focused on the individuals in independent living, probably just to avoid any interactions that could be perceived by family members as us taking advantage of someone in a situation where they may not have all of their cognitive assets. So we tried to approach most of our donors in terms of being proactive while they were in independent living, while at the same time still doing a more passive outreach to those in assisted living, and really waiting for them to come to us if they had an interest in making a gift.
Sounds like a sound plan.
Great question. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Let's move on. Kristin, I understand that you were working with an organization whose sole asset was a collection of antiquities. And then you say you received a phone call from the International Criminal Police Organization, otherwise known as Interpol.
I sure did.
Okay, so that sounds like a Dan Brown novel and not a typical day in the plan-giving office. Can you tell us what happened there?
Yes, it felt like a Dan Brown novel to me as well, because I was a relatively new plan giving officer, just sitting in my office doing my work, and got this phone call. This was when I was working for a community foundation, and we had multiple supporting organizations. And there was a gentleman in our town who's very, very philanthropic. He had funded multiple scholarships at a local college, the museum. He had a significant personal art collection. And prior to me arriving, he and his advisors moved probably 50 to 60 pieces of Greek and Roman artifacts into a foundation that was ultimately a supporting organization of the community foundation. And I was therefore secretary of that foundation. Those antiquities were then put on permanent display at our local museum. The local museum was responsible for insurance and upkeep of the pieces. So I didn't have a lot of contact with the pieces or working to preserve them. So my role was a little bit more administrative, which is much more administrative. And so I was responsible for holding the board meetings, taking meeting notes, confirming that insurance was in place, and the like. So it was just a big scare for me. What ultimately ended up happening is we clearly sent that up to people who had better knowledge and ability to handle it. And Interpol sent somebody in and reviewed the entire archive of pieces. And there were, in fact, some that they had determined were illegally taken. They did not accuse the donor of knowingly acquiring them. So he avoided any penalty. What I do not know is what happened as far as his gift. There was reason to believe that this gentleman acquired those assets knowing that they were illegally taken. It was a big scare for a new plan giving person.
Yeah, so as a novice, I'm just curious, when you get an asset like that given to the organization, a collection of antiquities, what does that transaction look like? I don't imagine you just get a box of antiquities dropped off at your front door.
Yes. I mean, we never actually took physical possession of them. They went directly from his storage to the art museum. And so we never actually saw them, but they were retitled in the name of the foundation, in the name of the Grant Miller Foundation.
Okay. And so if this scenario was turned into a movie, who would play the main character?
Me or the donor?
Oh, that's a good question. Let's say the donor.
The donor, I think it would have to be, you're going to have to come back to me on that. Talk to Joe and I'll come back.
Yeah, you think about that. Also think about who would play you as well.
Okay.
All right, Joe, how are you today?
Doing great, Grant. Looking forward to the visit.
Good. So I understand that you had a donor who was preparing to sell a business, and the donor wanted to make a significant charitable contribution by gifting shares to a charitable remainder trust. And as I understand it, ultimately the donor's advisors may have responded and given the donor maybe some poor advice or some, I don't really know how to describe that, but what happened there?
So great question. I think just a few general comments before we dive into this. I think as we all understand, we'd love for those donors to make cash gifts, but we also understand we would much prefer for them to give from their wealth, not from their disposable income. So we're seeing more and more situations now. I read recently that 2025 is called Peak 65. There are more people turning 65 this year than any other year in our country, 10,000 a day. And it's been going on for a while and continue to go on. The other statistic unique to this space is 80% of closely held businesses are owned by baby boomers in our country, 80%. And many of them are looking at retirement and thinking about their legacy and thinking about who they're going to leave their business to. So there's so many opportunities in this space. Now, the challenge is it's not easy. And in this situation, we began a conversation where the donor came forward and said, I know you're in a big capital campaign. I feel very comfortable. I could give $10 million or more. I'm very passionate about the cause. I want to make a difference, but my primary assets are in my businesses. So I have one business in particular I'm thinking about selling. Let's have a conversation about that. So that's where all this began. I'll quote another expert in this field. There's a guy named Brian Klontz who has a company called Charitable Solutions that he started a number of years ago, and they deal exclusively in non-cash asset gifts. And Brian shared with me recently that about 1 out of 8 of the people who call them and say they want to make a gift, actually the gift gets completed. So it's not unusual as we learn more. But in this situation, let's talk specifically about this situation. So the good news is he owned the business by himself. That's always a big question. Who owns it? Is there another partner? How's it held? Is it a C Corp? Is it an S Corp? All these other pieces that we need to understand. So it was a simple arrangement in this case. It was a C Corp. But then you've got to involve, in most cases, an attorney. You have to involve a CPA. You have to involve a business broker. And what happens when somebody is selling a business is the business has been appraised, and then they're trying to help you get the best deal. And in many cases, and that was very true in this case, the business broker's commission was based on what the business sold for. So what happened in this case is for a closely held asset to be given to a charitable remainder trust, one of the really important pieces is the sale can't be agreed to. In other words, there can't be a written document where the sale has been consummated about the business before the assets are given to the trust, because it has to be a charitable gift, right? So that's another important piece. So the good news was we didn't have any consummated deal and no written agreement signed, but the business broker in this situation made lots of noise about how it was going to cost him money. And at the end of the day, that shut it down. So, you have to understand who all the players are. One of the things we do in our teaching is we tell fundraisers, you really have to sell a big gift twice, once to the donor and once to their advisors, because they have to agree to this, right? They have to be comfortable and tell their clients that this is in their best interest and it's a win-win situation, right? Now, here's the positive news. He did actually sell the first business for a significant amount of money, and he ended up making an outright gift. He did make an outright gift of some of the closely held securities before the business was sold. So it was a win at the end of the day. Wasn't quite as big as they wanted it to be. Then he also made an outright gift of appreciated securities after he sold the business. So it was significant. And he made a significant gift to a donor advised fund. So those are all positives. And now here's the real home run, though. And this is what I love about the story. He reached out to me about 6 months ago and he said, Joe, I now fully understand why it was in my best interest to make this closely held gift to the Charitable Remainder Unit Trust. I didn't fully get it the first time around, but this time, so now he's selling a second business. He said, guess what? We're going to make it happen. I've already talked to the broker. I don't care what his commission is. It's my gift. So we love it when those kind of things happen. Again, I think every gift, in particular a gift, the larger a gift becomes, the more the donor wants to also direct the gift. It may be more restricted and it may be more complex. And look, we all understand that most of our successes are going to be traditional bequest and beneficiary designations, but we have a unique window. We've talked about this great wealth transfer that's happening now, right? I don't know if you just saw in USA Giving, we just did a blog. USA Giving in 1984 to the United States, $4 billion was given by bequest and beneficiary designations to charity. Last year, 2024, $45 billion, right? So from $4 billion to $45 billion. And those big gifts are happening because of all these assets that people own, homes that they own, not just real estate, but retirement plans. And we have to be engaging more of these people in these conversations about including us in those estate plans. So thanks for letting me share. I'll stop there.
Sure, that was a complex answer to a complex question, and I appreciate that. As a member of the creative team here at Sharpe, a lot of what you said kind of obviously went over my head, but thank you for that. And does anyone have any follow-up questions for that, or has anyone had any similar experiences?
I think everything that I've heard actually is a good segue to what I wanted to mention. You know, we've heard to date what I'll call difficult or non-traditional assets. We had someone selling a car. We had a gift of art. We had a closely held business. And we've had donors at different level of either mental capacity or financial sophistication. You had an older person in declining acuity. You had a town philanthropic leader. You had a business owner, and they all had various blind spots, so to speak. So you might think the case I'm going to tell about is going to solve all your problems. So a lot of people think this might be a dream donor. You have an alumnus. Your alumnus went through schooling on the strength of a scholarship and went on to be a corporate partner at a global law firm. The lawyer also sat for many years as a trustee of his institution and as a trustee of his alma mater's charitable foundation. He also serves as an outside director of a global healthcare corporation. And he decides, he raises his hand and comes to the institution and says, I would like to contribute $30 million. And I've got the asset, $30 million of this publicly traded company. And my requests are modest. I want this gift to be used for endowment, and it's going to be an endowment core purposes. I want a third of the gift to be used for scholarships. I want the middle third to be used for professorship, and I'd like the last third for a fund to promote innovation and research at the college, was specifically a law school. University says these are all wonderful. Gift agreement is signed, and within 30 days, a lawless wire transfer of $30 million. All seems to be well. And then 9 months after the gift agreement, our donor is run over by a car in a crosswalk in a sleepy part of Naples, Florida. So not to worry, the lawyer, as you might expect, has a sophisticated executor. Interestingly enough, not his son, not his spouse, both of whom are graduates of the same institution that he gave. It takes about 6 years to administer the estate. It had other complex assets, and the estate's letters of administration to close the estate, the accounting. So what could go wrong? Clear donor intent, clear asset. The gift was completed before death. The remaining transactions to solve the administration of the estate were approved. So you might wonder, when the estate is now settled in January of 2008, how could it be that some 17 years later, the son is most unhappy? The son is upset because the endowment declined from about 30 million to 21 million. It's not clear the information in the public record why that is. And the son is upset that the gift itself incurred what I'll call a university-imposed endowment tax, which was very reasonable. It was only about 1.3%. But the son tries to get the estate reopened. The probate court says, we have nothing to, this isn't our concern. The gift was made before death. And by the way, the only authority that's got jurisdiction is the Ohio State Attorney General, and they don't see anything that's occurred that is wrong. So the son, undaunted, but still without a victory, for the last 10 years has been lobbying the Ohio State Legislature for a provision that names endowment donors as having legal standing in probate court to argue for the ability to comment and object to how an endowment is run. So from my perspective, I don't see anything that was, quote, inappropriate, but I do see things that might have been done to avoid that. And before I give my opinion, I'd be interested in Kristin or Julie or Joe's. From what you've heard here, is there anything that you might have raised on these facts?
One of the simple answers is what Julie mentioned at the outset, is to ensure that all of the family members are on board with this gift. Maybe have them included in the meeting and make sure they have a firm understanding of what to expect prior to the gift being made.
Oh, yeah. And notwithstanding that the wife of the donor and the adult son of the donor, notwithstanding they were both graduates of the same place and professed their deep affection and love for the institution, they did object. Now, interestingly, they've never asked for the money back, but they really do have a burr under their saddle about the endowment fee, which is even more interesting because during the tenure of this donor, he was the head of the foundation, and it was during his administration that the endowment tax was approved. So you would think the donor at least had no objection, but I do wonder whether there was anything in the earlier endowment agreements that referred to it. And then I think the other takeaway would be, even though, quote, the donor is gone, you have the need for thoughtful stewardship. Because I don't get the sense in reviewing the legal proceeding and the public record that there were regular reports on how the endowment was doing and how the funds were expended. And what really got the son upset was the endowment was in part to provide 30 full scholarships every year, and there were years it was fewer than that. So you have a case here, motivated donor, best of intentions, what I'll call an evergreen need of an institution, and yet it goes off the rails, and no charity wants to be on the receiving end of a 17-year campaign, fruitless as it has been. So I think that really caught my attention, and I've been following this now for 17 years. At some point, somebody's going to give up.
Well, I'd be interested to see how this turns out.
Yes, and just this past June, at the last minute, the Speaker of the Ohio State Senate removed the bill that would have authorized the donor's son to demand and other similarly situated donors' involvement in the accounting of an endowment. So the irony is you've got a non-lawyer son who has probably shown as much tenacity in litigating as his deal-making, non-litigious father.
Chris, what do you think the son's real issue is?
I think that would involve employing the services of my wife, who is double boarded in neurology and psychiatry. He doesn't want the money back. That has never been asked for. I thought it was an interesting tell. The son wasn't named an executor or co-executor. So I'm wondering what was going on there. Could be perfectly innocent. I don't know whether dear old dad communicated in advance what was going on. When the gift was made, the gift agreement was signed and $30 million was transferred. I mean, that's generally unusual for a gift of that magnitude to be paid in full so quickly. But here we are.
Well, Chris, this is Joe. Yeah, I think it illustrates how critical stewardship is in our business, and in particular, a gift that size. I can't tell you how many, having worked for the University of Illinois, how many endowment gifts were created. Not all of those were $1 million gifts. Some of those were $100,000 scholarship arrangements, but they don't always do a good job of letting the family know, particularly with the legacy gift, of all the great things the gift is doing for the university. They get a little too caught up in chasing that next big gift. and they're not taking care of that core group. And that same thing applies to a lot of these people who raise their hand during life and say, this institution meant the world to me. I treat the institution as a member of my family, and I'm leaving significant money to them in my estate. And we don't steward those people because they're not making those big, regular, annual gifts. But it's a big part of our business. It's a fascinating story, and it illustrates the human behavior is not predictable. We do the best we can.
That's why any trial lawyer worth her or his salt never wants a case to go to trial. You have to be prepared to go to trial. Juries are maddeningly unpredictable because humans are maddeningly unpredictable.
Well, it sounds like there was definitely more to the family dynamics than we know. And I guess the bottom line is it was the father's money and he could choose what he wanted to do with it.
Yeah, that could well be what was the driver. And the son, best I can discern, he's an accomplished professional in his own right in investment banking. He's never asked for the money back.
That was my first impression or thought was, I talk to a lot of donors and write stories where they'll say, well, our kids are doing fine. We're going to leave our money to this organization. And so my first thought was, oh, maybe he ran into some trouble and needs some money and doesn't appreciate that he didn't get it, which, I was maybe curious. Maybe you all don't really deal with this end of things, but do you have any other experiences where after a gift was given after the fact, maybe you're dealing with a disgruntled family member who perhaps felt excluded from their parents' estate plans?
I can say yes. It's a case in the public record. Widower, late 80s, but very sharp, wanted to and partially endowed before death a scholarship. He would have fully endowed it, but his broker transcribed some of the numbers incorrectly, and it was wire transferred by the wrong account. We figured out where it went to. And then the son refused to acknowledge it in his capacity as an executor that this was a valid debt of the estate. And one of the 3 times in my career where I asked a CEO, I think this was an appropriate case to sue. And it was for a relatively small amount of money. But the concern was if we didn't protect our legal rights, we felt our even larger capacity donors wouldn't take seriously any pledge agreement. So we thought, well, if we're going to pursue our effort to be paid the balance, this is a good test case. And we actually had an alumnus lawyer who very skillfully negotiated an out-of-court settlement that was acceptable. Certainly to us, I think that the son was surprised that the charity decided to protect its rights. And that's one thing as an aside, I'm always bemused. There are donors or relatives of donors who somehow are under the impression that because an organization is not for profit and tax exempt, they're not going to be that sophisticated or they're going to cave in quickly at the first sign of resistance. I don't know whether, again, Kristin or Julie or Joe have ever seen this, where the charity has more steel in the spine than the donor's family was anticipating.
I was wondering about that too. I was thinking perhaps a lot of people view a charity as being a very benevolent organization because most nonprofits are doing things that in their view are making the world a better place.
Yeah.
So I was wondering about that too, if perhaps heirs would have the perception that they could kind of push these organizations around. Or
yes, I don't know whether anyone had a comment on that.
Anybody else have anything to add to this? Okay.
I think that money makes people behave in ways that you maybe didn't expect or hadn't seen before. And I'll just leave it at that.
I agree with that statement 100%. I think we all can.
And I will add, I do think people tend to forget that in a lot of ways, a nonprofit is a business. They have budgets, they have fixed expenses, they have employees, they have their mission, and money can't just come in and out and it not have an impact on the entire organization. So I do think people tend to not respect the business acumen and the business needs of a nonprofit.
Agreed, very much.
Thanks. And Chris, earlier you did a great job of sort of summing up these interesting and unique gifts and circumstances. We talked about a gift of property of a vehicle, antiquities. What are some other really unique, interesting, non-traditional, or just plain strange gifts that you all have helped foster for an organization?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily a strange gift, but anyone in development will have had this experience. You get a call from someone you have no recollection of being affiliated with your organization, and they very enthusiastically are inquiring whether you would like to accept a gift of real estate. And of course, most fundraisers, are always trying to find a way to get to yes on any gift. But my observation, myself and that of others whom I've known, when you get the call out of the blue for the gift of real estate, it's best to practice what I call the ruthless efficiency of candor. And I do that in a form of question. I say, have you ever contributed to our organization? Is there any existing debt on this property? Would you be willing to pay for an environmental impact statement should we get to the position where we think we could accept that? Boy, does that lead to a lot of clicks quickly, because by the time your organization gets the call, you would probably not the first. We'll just leave it at that. Different case involving someone that has been involved, someone who's had a demonstrated record of some type of support. Then you have to be patient and work through the issues to get the debt removed, deal with the environmental impact. And a lot of these issues can be addressed up front when an organization has a good gift acceptance policy that governs the acceptance of many categories of gift, most notably real estate.
Also imagine that nonprofit organizations don't necessarily want to become landlords.
No, they don't. The only time I've noticed this, any major university, private or public, they're very aware of the properties that are around the perimeter of their campus. And they know more than probably the property owners think they know about the property and its potential value for expanding the footprint of an institution. But generally, that's the type of real estate they can live with. But you're on the East Coast and there's a gift of real estate on the West Coast. You're going to have to figure a lot of things out. You probably want to sell the property right away.
Chris, you have jogged my memory. I have two gifts of real estate that track with what you have said. When I, again, was at a community foundation, it was big enough, but it hadn't really gotten so big that it was moving along on its own. And so given your circumstances and your mission, whether you say yes or no may vary. And in one situation, we had a very influential board member who was very committed to the organization moving forward. And he happened to have a warehouse in California. And we were in Memphis and knew that we were getting in a little over our head. But he had a lot of sway and influence in the community. He really felt like this would benefit the organization. There was no one on site to manage it. It took a long time to sell. And ultimately, there was a fire. Yeah. There were homeless people living in it, and they were cooking or warming themselves up, and the warehouse burned down. So in all, we probably should have said no, but we did end up net a little bit of money, but the board member and the donor was happy, and long-term, that was probably worth it. In another instance, another thing that we did at the Community Foundation is sometimes we would accept real estate on behalf of another organization. So a small nonprofit had a donor who wanted to give him an excellent piece of property just a mile down the street from us, and it was a dud. We knew it was a dud, but the donor kept telling the small nonprofit, oh, it's worth $300,000. It's going to be great. It's going to be transformational for you. And we needed to play nicely with the other nonprofits in town and display that we were partners with them. So ultimately we did accept it, in part because it was just down the street. It took forever to sell, and it sold for probably about $120,000, substantially less than what the donor had told the nonprofit. And there was some tension there. The nonprofit sort of blamed us for not getting the value that the donor was convinced it was worth. But again, they ultimately got something, and we learned our lesson to be maybe a little bit more careful in those circumstances. So every gift is different, and your reasons for saying yes depend on where you are in the lifespan of a nonprofit.
Yes.
So, Grant, I just want to go back to the conversation about gift acceptance policies. And I think they're so important, especially in these situations, as a way to fall back. I had an experience, and some of our listeners who are working with smaller organizations may relate to this, where your donors feel like you can be the recipient of all of their stuff. So they're cleaning out closets. And in particular, I worked for an organization who served people experiencing homelessness. And well, we're giving you old clothes or what have you, and you can be overwhelmed. They don't consider your staffing capacity, the capacity of your space to hold these things. And so trying to communicate your appreciation while declining the gift can sometimes be a challenge. And I think those policies come in very handy when you say, well, this is just the board has agreed that these are things that we're just not willing to accept due to certain circumstances. So I can't emphasize that enough, having those policies and revisiting them as you need to.
Well, it sounds like some of those gifts are dual organization gifts because part of the gift goes to the initial organization and then the rest of the gift goes to goodwill. So
that's true.
Are there any others that you all want to mention?
Memphis is a very small town, and I'm not from Memphis. And my very first day as director of planned giving at the Community Foundation of Greater Memphis, I remember it all so vividly. First days are some of the toughest. And I got there at 8. And at 10:15, I had a call transferred to me. And a gracious old Southern woman was on the phone. And she introduced herself in a way that was clear to me that I was supposed to know exactly who she was. And I did not, but I played along. And in a few quick sentences, she let me know that she would like to give the foundation her funeral home. And what was happening, they were a long-established family in town. They had the funeral home in town and an enormous building on one of the main streets. And as happens in many towns, most of the business and residences had moved out into the suburbs. And so they had decided to move their operations out further east. And we were in a small office space. We didn't have a physical presence in town. So she just thought that was a great idea to give us the funeral home. Needless to say, we thought about it for a little bit and we decided she was right. So we accepted a funeral home. It is a spectacular building on a main street in Memphis, big columns. It looks very stately. The hang-up was, though, that their embalming facilities had not been complete. We took ownership of the building, yet they were still embalming some bodies for a while. And then they cleared out, and we were really able, it was a little awkward, but we really were able to turn it into a wonderful space. But it had a lot of quirks. We turned the main room where they held funerals into a community room where nonprofits in town could hold meetings. But it did have a chute for the flowers to go into the basement. And we had a big drive-in, drive-out basement for the hearse to be. And our elevators were really long and big with doors on either side. It was just, there were things still hanging in closets. There was still some stuff in the storeroom. So, I mean, we had a lot of fun with it. And the Community Foundation has operated in that space for 20 years now, and they've just moved out to do a full renovation. But it's a spectacular space, and it really suits the foundation. We just had to be a little creative and roll with it, and it ended up being wonderful. But literally my first day of work, a funeral home.
This could be the first charity I could ever think of that would have to check to make sure they don't have a conflict of interest if they're embalming a past donor. It just looks awkward.
Yeah, you would think a little too close.
A little too, or you are embalming him and you want to give Harry or Sally a send-off befitting of being a great donor.
Exactly. But we had this garage for the hearses to pull in and out. And we had a donor who was starting a museum about Stax music recording. And that donor had Isaac Hayes' bright blue Cadillac limousine, but he had nowhere to put it. So we stored it in the basement of the funeral home for 6 months until the museum was able to store it. So it ended up having a lot more benefits than just being an excellent office space.
Wow, I imagine it takes a few years to shake off the vibe of a funeral home.
It did, and we
no matter what you're
tell
trying
everybody.
to create.
If somebody didn't know, we just didn't mention it.
Yeah, used to be a church.
or library.
Yeah, it used to be a library.
It's where many people were beginning their trek to a higher authority, a better place, a better place.
Yes, and just ignore Isaac Hayes' gold-plated Cadillac in the basement.
That's right.
It was bright blue with sparkles and white shag carpet with a bar in the back seat.
It was bright blue. Yeah, I think, is that the one that's in the museum now? Have you been there?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah,
Yes,
if you're ever in Memphis,
of that.
if you're ever in Memphis, I highly recommend the Stax Museum.
My, oh my.
Any other really unique or strange gifts? Kristin, I actually think that's a great idea to do a whole show on unique or strange gifts. So if you're out there listening and you're an organization that has received some really unique or strange gifts, be sure and send us an email and let us know. And maybe we'll bring you on to that show when we do that one.
Speaking of death and dying, what was coming to my mind is, how do you react to someone, especially someone who's been a supporter of whatever the level, and they come and tell you they've got a very bad medical diagnosis and they want to accelerate their giving? And have to have a mix of compassion and humanity and also practicality, because should the person be doing this for whatever reasons? I'm still trying to get the image of the Cadillac and the shag carpet. And
I'll send you some pictures, Chris.
The images that come to mind without even seeing pictures are troubling enough, but I'll look at them. Sure. Why not?
Okay. Well, Kristin, we have to know now what we've all been wondering and thinking about this whole time is who's going to play you in the Antiquities movie.
Okay. I just have to say Margot Robbie. I mean, there's no reason not to. And then the donor, I'm sorry, but I think it has to be Kevin Spacey. Maybe Jack Nicholson.
Yeah, he's a very multidimensional actor. Well, thank you all for sharing your stories. And if any of our listeners have similar stories, please send us an email or contact us and let us know your stories and some interesting and unique gifts that you've gotten. So these stories are, more than cautionary tales. I believe that they are roadmaps to ensure that your gifts go right, because most of your stories ended up with the gifts actually going right, but you learned a lot of lessons and valuable things along the way.
And did go through a lot of stress, though. So in a way, they are tales from the crypt.
Tales from the crypt. I like that. Thanks for listening. We hope today's discussion gave you practical takeaways to grow your plan giving program. To submit questions and topics for future episodes, go to sharpegroup.org or listen to us on your favorite podcast app. If you found this podcast insightful, be sure to like, review, and subscribe. Until then, stay sharp.